Welcome, brave souls. You thought it was over, but the terror has only just begun. The Vine in the Rose Bush, Part 2. Horror story that will leave you shivering. So prepare yourself for second part and let's move on to our story. The boy dragged the trunk up the fine gravel walk, but before he reached the steps leading up to the piazza, for the house stood on a terrace. The front door opened and a fair, frizzled head of a very large and handsome woman appeared. She held up her black silk skirt, disclosing voluminous ruffles of starched embroidery, and waited for Rebecca. She smiled placidly, her pink, double-chinned face widened and dimpled, but her blue eyes were wary and calculating. She extended her hand as Rebecca climbed the steps. "This is Miss Flint, I suppose," said she. "Yes, ma'am," replied Rebecca, noticing with bewilderment a curious expression compounded of fear and defiance on the other's face. "Your letter only arrived this morning," said Mrs. Dent in a steady voice. Her great face was a uniform pink and her china blue eyes were at once aggressive and veiled with secrecy. "Yes, I hardly thought you would get my letter," replied Rebecca. "I felt as if I could not wait to hear from you before I came. I supposed you would be so situated that you could have me a little while without putting you out too much. From what John used to write me about his circumstances, and when I had that money so unexpected, I felt as if I must come for Agnes. I suppose you will be willing to give her up. You know, she is my own blood, and of course she has no relation to you, though you must have got attached to her. I know from her picture what a sweet girl she must be, and John always said she looked like her own mother, and Grace was a beautiful woman if she was my sister." Rebecca stopped and stared at the other woman in amazement and alarm. The great handsome blonde creature stood speechless, livid, gasping with her hand to her heart, her lips parted in a horrible caricature of smile. "Are you sick?" cried Rebecca, drawing near. "Don't you want me to get you some water?" Then Mrs. Dent recovered herself with a great effort. "It is nothing," she said. "I am subject to spells. I am over it now. Won't you come in, Miss Flint?" As she spoke, the beautiful deep rose color suffused her face. Her blue eyes met her visitor's with the opaqueness of turquoise, with a revelation of blue, but a concealment of all behind. Rebecca followed her hostess in, and the boy who had waited quiescently climbed the steps with the trunk. But before they entered the door, a strange thing happened. On the upper terrace, the season though it was, one small red, perfect rose. Rebecca looked at it, and the other woman extended her hand with a quick gesture. "Don't you pick that rose," she brusquely cried. Rebecca drew herself up with stiff dignity. "I ain't in the habit of picking other folks' roses without leave," said she. As Rebecca spoke, she started violently and lost sight of her resentment, for something singular happened. Suddenly, the rose bush was agitated violently as if by a gust of wind, yet it was a remarkably still day. Not a leaf of the hydrangea standing on the terrace close to the rose trembled. "What on earth?" began Rebecca. Then she stopped with a gasp at the sight of the other woman's face. Although a face, it gave somehow the impression of a desperately clutched hand of secrecy. "Come in," said she in a harsh voice. which seemed to come forth from her chest with no intervention of the organs of speech. "Come into the house, I'm getting cold out here." "What makes that rose bush blow so when there isn't any wine?" asked Rebecca, trembling with vague horror yet resolute. "I don't see as it's blowing," returned the woman calmly. And as she spoke, indeed, the bush was quiet. "It was blowing," declared Rebecca. "It isn't now," said Mrs. Dent. "I can't try to account for everything that blows out of doors. I have too much to do." She spoke scornfully and confidently with defiant, unflinching eyes, first on the bush, then on Rebecca, and led the way into the house. "It looked queer," persisted Rebecca, but she followed, and also the boy with the trunk. Rebecca entered an interior, prosperous, even elegant according to her simple ideas. There were Brussels carpet, lace curtains, and plenty of brilliant upholstery and polished wood. "You are real nicely situated," remarked Rebecca, after she had become a little accustomed to her new surroundings and the two women were seated at the tea table. Mrs. Dent stared with a hard complacency from behind her silver-plated service. "Yes, I be," said she. "You got all the things new?" said Rebecca hesitatingly, with a jealous memory of her dead sister's bridal furnishings. "Yes," said Mrs. Dent. "I was never one to want dead folk things, and I had money enough of my own, so I wasn't beholden to John. I had the old dirts put up at auction. They didn't bring much. I suppose you saved some for Agnes. She'll want some of her poor mother's things when she's grown up," said Rebecca with some indignation. The defiant stare of Mrs. Dent's blue eyes waxed more intense. "There's a few things up garret," said she. "She'll be likely to value them," remarked Rebecca. As she spoke, she glanced at the window. "Isn't it most time for her to be coming home?" she asked. "Most time," answered Mrs. Dent carelessly. "But when she gets over to Eddie Slocum's, she never knows when to come home." "Is Eddie Slocum her intimate friend?" "Intimate as any. Maybe we can have her come out to see Agnes when she is living with me," said Rebecca wistfully. "I suppose she'll be likely to be homesick at first." "Most likely," answered Mrs. Dent. "Does she call you mother?" Rebecca asked. "No, she calls me Aunt Emmeline," replied the other woman shortly. "When did you say you were going home?" "In about a week, I thought, if she can be ready to go soon," answered Rebecca with a surprised look. She reflected that she would not remain a day longer than she could help after such an inhospitable look and question. "Oh, as far as that goes," said Mrs. Dent, "it wouldn't make any difference about her being ready. You could go home whenever you felt that you must, and she could come afterward." "Alone?" "Why not? She's a big girl now, and you don't have to change cars. My niece will go home when I do, and not travel alone. And if I can't wait here for her, in the house that used to be her mother's and my sister's home, I'll go and board somewhere," returned Rebecca with warmth. "Oh, you can stay here as long as you want to. You're welcome," said Mrs. Dent. Then Rebecca started. "There she is," she declared in a trembling, exultant voice. Nobody knew how she longed to see the girl. "She isn't as late as I thought she'd be," said Mrs. Dent, and again that curious, subtle change passed over her face, and again it settled into the stony impassiveness. Rebecca stared at the door, waiting for it to open. Where is she? She asked presently. I guess she stopped to take off her hat in the entry, suggested Mrs. Dent. Rebecca waited. Why don't she come? It can't take her all this time to take off her hat. For answer, Mrs. Dent rose with a stiff jerk and threw open the door. Agnes, she called. Agnes. Then she turned and eyed Rebecca. She ain't there. I saw her pass the window, said Rebecca in bewilderment. You must have been mistaken. I know I did, persisted Rebecca. You couldn't have. I did. I saw first a shadow go over the ceiling. Then I saw her in the glass there. She pointed to a mirror over the sideboard opposite. And then the shadow passed the window. How did she look in the glass? Little and light-haired, with the light hair kind of tossing over her forehead. You couldn't have seen her. Was that like Agnes? Like enough. But of course you didn't see her. You have been thinking so much about her that you thought you did? I thought I saw a shadow pass the window. But I must have been mistaken. She didn't come in, or we would have seen her before now. I knew it was too early for her to get home from Eddie Slocum's anyhow. When Rebecca went to bed, Agnes had not returned. Rebecca had resolved that she would not retire until the girl came. But she was very tired and she reasoned with herself that she was foolish. Besides, Mrs. Dent suggested that Agnes might go to the church social with Eddie Slocum. When Rebecca suggested that she be sent for and told that her aunt had come, Mrs. Dent laughed meaningly. I guess you'll find out that a young girl ain't so ready to leave a sociable, where there is boys, to see her aunt, said she. She's too young, said Rebecca incredulously and indignantly. She's 16, replied Mrs. Dent, and she's always been great for the boys. She's going to school 4 years after I get her before she think of boys, declared Rebecca. Well, we'll see, laughed the other woman. After Rebecca went to bed, she lay awake a long time listening for the sound of girlish laughter and a boy's voice under her window. Then she fell asleep. The next morning she was down early. Mrs. Dent, who kept no servants, was busily preparing breakfast. Don't Agnes help you about breakfast? Asked Rebecca. No, I let her lay, replied Mrs. Dent shortly. What time did she get home last night? She didn't get home. She stayed with Eddie. She often does. Without sending you word? Oh, she knew I wouldn't worry. When she'll be home? Oh, I guess she'll be alone pretty soon. And that's where we leave our story for now. The mystery deepens and the horror grows. But there is more to uncover. If you enjoy this part, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next chilling installment. And make sure to turn on the notification bell to be the first to know when the next part is released. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe and keep the light on.